right. Welcome, everyone, to our first AIMS panel this morning. My name is Rocki Wentzel. This is Labyrinths and their travelers. I hope you all have been finding the conference as refreshing and inspiring as I have after what I'm sure for many of you is a very busy fall term. If you would like to post about our conference on social media, I wanted to remind you of the hashtags, hashtags AIMS 2021 and Antiquity Now, hashtag Antiquity Now. All right. Following each introduction, as I'm sure many of you are used to at this point, you'll hear a 5-minute summary from each of our panelists, and then we'll save all of the Q&A for the end. Just a reminder to audience members to please put your questions into the chat directly to me, and I will make sure our panelists hear your question. So without any further delay to start, it's my pleasure to introduce Hamish Williams, a junior fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. He has previously held a Humboldt postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of English and American Studies, Friedrich Schiller University Jena. His primary field of research is classical reception studies, focusing on the post-classical afterlives and reimaginations of ancient Greek and Roman thought. But he is also broadly interested in library studies from the perspective of the history of cultural ideas, covering topics such as utopianism, the sublime, hospitality, and catastrophe. His previous project explored classical reception and fantasy writings with the edited volume Tolkien and the Classical World, and the upcoming monograph, J.R.R. Tolkien's Utopianism and the Classics. While his current project focuses on the reception of ancient utopias in modern literature and other media, particularly modern receptions of Minoan Crete. Beyond academic writing, Hamish also practices his research, trying his hand at children's fantasy stories with classical themes.
Thank you very much, Rocki, for that great introduction. Can you all hear me? Is that all right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm briefly going to try to summarize my chat. Let me see if I can share the screen. There was some doubt whether that would actually work, so let me see if that that works. Can you all see that if I share my PowerPoint? Okay, super. So the topic of my talk was autistic, blind, and socially anxious minotaurs, postmodern monsters in the fiction of Stephen Sherrill, Ruth Rendell, and Peter Goldsworthy. Okay, so before I kind of got to these specific novels, I started off just giving a brief background in the Minotaur. So obviously in classical myths, the references in Ovid and Catullus, and obviously in Greek black figure Vase, right? But after the classical period, the Minotaur doesn't really figure much apart from in, for example, Dante's Inferno, a brief reference there, but it's really in the 20th century where there's this real fascination with the figure of the Minotaur, which kind of goes hand in hand with this movement which has been called Cretomania or Neo-Minoanism, this fascination with all things Minoan since the discoveries of Sir Arthur Evans at Knossos. Okay, so as part of this movement, the Minotaur becomes a very important archetypal monster. And so we see him in all different kinds of 20th century popular genres. And I've given some examples there in sword and sandal, epic, right? In historical fiction like Mary Renault, in literary fiction, if we can use such an elitist term like Lawrence Durrell's The Dark Labyrinth, in science fiction like Doctor Who, as the other panelist looks at today, in horror stories like Stephen King's Rose Madder, and even in fantasy like C.S. Lewis's adapted Narnia films. Okay, so the Minotaur features across all these different genres and also in different forms. It can be an actual monster, it can be a human who is sort of compared to a Minotaur, or it can be like a psychological construct. Okay, the basic idea of my speech was that prior to more recent rewritings of the Minotaur, the basic idea is that protagonists kill this Minotaur, that they overcome this physical monster or this human who is like a Minotaur or the psychological demon in their head, that they kind of vanquish this Minotaur. And so the purpose of my speech was to look at some other more interesting recent stories which kind of invert this narrative, and with a Minotaur isn't killed at the end of the story and undergo some kind of more interesting personal journey. And so the one novel I is called Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break by Stephen Sherrill, literary fiction by an American writer. This is in 2000, and in this piece we have a Minotaur who's living, it's the actual Minotaur living in 20th century America, and he's working in a traditional American diner, and he goes about his sort of daily life. Okay, and the next story was a sort of a detective story in a sort of English tradition of manor and sort of God and murder mystery stories, and the Minotaur here is a middle-aged man who's being victimized by his family. And lastly, I looked at that was 2005, and lastly I looked at a story from 2 years ago by Peter Goldsworthy. This is an Australian writer of literary fiction, and in the story we have a Minotaur, again, not an actual Minotaur like in Barbara Vine's story where the term Minotaur is being used metaphorically, but he's a policeman who's been blinded and is being stalked by the criminal who blinded him and has escaped from jail. Okay, so it's sort of a thriller story. Okay, so I looked at these three stories, and my basic idea is that these stories define these characters, these Minotaurs, not through sort of traditional ideas of monstrosity, but through certain modern disorders which are termed which are characterized through medical language, whether it's the Minotaur takes a cigarette break, who has actual physical pain, and he has sexual disorders, and he has a speech impediment, and he's got a sort of form of PTSD from remembering his times in Crete. He also has extreme social anxiety, so he's a complex of all these different problems. In Barbara Vine's story, or Ruth Rendell, that's Barbara Vine's nom de plume, this middle-aged Minotaur man is autistic. And in Peter Goldsworthy's recent literary fiction, this Minotaur is blind, right? He's been shot, he's a policeman, he's blind. So it's really using the term Minotaur to capture all these different disorders, right? And so my basic idea in my speech, if I'm probably really running over time, was that these novels move beyond just creating empathy for these Minotaurs, but they're interested in establishing journeys for these Minotaurs, which they go on from initially being stuck in their labyrinths, and there's very different types of labyrinths. It can be like a temporal labyrinth in the case of Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break, where he's sort of stuck between the past and present, the past and future. Or in another story, it's sort of a psychological labyrinth of the autistic man who can't kind of work his way through his thoughts, but also he actually discovers a physical labyrinth in this old manor house. Or again, there's a physical labyrinth in the story of Peter Goldsworthy's Minotaur, but there's also a kind of a cognitive labyrinth where this blind man has to kind of work his way through these dark paths, right? Okay, so there's all different types of labyrinths. My basic idea is that these Minotaurs find the way out of the labyrinths in various ways, and I hope to discuss that more through the question section of this discussion, but I think I should stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Hamish. All right, so moving on to our next panelist, Angelique Vagopoulou is an existential psychotherapist integrating aspects of a Jungian analytical psychology and dream work in her research. She is a member of UKCP, the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, and runs a small private practice in the south of England. She specializes in psychotherapy for cancer, as well as psychotherapy for neurological disorders. She holds a diploma in psychology, a master's in applied neuropsychology from the University of Nottingham, and an MSc in existential psychology and psychotherapy from Middlesex University. Since 2008, she has been conducting research on the Eleusinian myth and mysteries, in particular their relevance in today's world. Her thesis for the MSc in psychotherapy has the title Demeter and Persephone, Phenomenology of a Myth. And for the last 8 years, she has been working with cancer patients, basing her work on aspects and archetypal images presented in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, as well as on documented evidence on the mysteries of Eleusis. The last 3 years, she disseminated findings of her research through teaching seminars, publishing articles in scientific journals, and giving lectures in universities and organizations in Greece and the UK. So welcome, Angelique.
Thank you very much, Rocki, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. I will start by sharing my screen so that the stages are there. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the goddess of earth and fertility loses her child to Hades, the god of the underworld. Persephone is abducted and taken violently to a journey of descent, suffering, isolation, darkness, and consequent transformation before she is able to re-emerge, ascending to her mother and the world of the living. Now, in the Eleusinian narrative, the evolutionary steps of mother and daughter stories are specific and distinctive and can be traced and described as existential phenomenological stages in the process of a cancer journey from the moment of diagnosis to the return of the person to a fully restored health and everyday life. A deep existential crisis is set in motion with a cancer diagnosis, and it is then that a kind of descent into the darkness begins, whether the person wants it or not. Violation and rupture of one's life as they knew it, trauma, a sense of loss and grief and mourning seem to be stages a person goes through, exactly like the goddesses and like the initiates during the Eleusinian rites. Involuntary descent into the darkness of embodiment matches the initiate's patheme, as Aristotle described it for the mysteries. Aristotle said that it was not about learning, but really about experiencing, meaning it also physically as well as emotionally. So physical suffering, confusion, sense of disorientation were also reported as part of the initiate's experiences, according to Milonas. The inevitability of death and near-death experiences were followed by a shift in perspective, a transformation of consciousness, an illumination, a true seeing into how one should live after having faced death. Just like at the Eleusinian mysteries, I found that in a cancer journey, life is never so close to death and death to life. And the dark night of the soul and the dying of the old self are and were experienced both, in my view, during cancer and the initiation at Eleusis. The Eleusinian mysteries lasted for 2,000 years, taking place in the outskirts of Athens at Eleusis, and they seemed to have influenced during this time both the individual participants as ancient Greece as a whole. Now, every year, the initiates witnessing goddess Persephone's abduction and descent to Hades, as well as her sacred union in the underworld, they were also taking part into both the grieving and the celebrations upon her return. So my idea was to use this as a guide map to help my clients who have been diagnosed with cancer to navigate through the stages they go through, to have a kind of a helpful map, like a kind of a compass that we are both using in the psychotherapeutic sessions. The stages, the identified stages, were the abduction and catabasis, the descent. Another stage, the next stage, is search and despair, according to the goddesses, grief and withdrawal, famine and death, from lament to laughter, and in the end, reunion and regeneration. So the religiously contained reenactment during the mystery rites, as it also happens in a cancer journey, would culminate in a sort of existential remembering, a recollection, as well as a reconnection of the mystic, the initiates, with nature, their gods, their very own instinctive life. Pindar writes, "Blessed is the one who has seen these things before one goes beneath the earth, for then one understands the end of the mortal life and the beginning of the new life." Thank you.
Thank you, Angelique. All right, and our last panelist, Alicia Matz. began her PhD career at Boston University in the fall of 2017. She earned her BA in Class 6 in 2015 from the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, and her MA in Class 6 from Rutgers University in 2017. Her research interests include Augustan literature, politics, and material culture and reception, especially in science fiction and fantasy literature. She currently is working on her dissertation, which is titled Diana in Augustan Poetry and Culture. In her free time, she runs the @LOTR in Latin Twitter, where she is translating Tolkien's Lord of the Rings slowly into Latin, as well as at Lodula Dicit, where she tweets as Baby Yoda in Latin. She also helps admin at Crypt Antiquity, and her main Twitter is at Dux Femina Facti 9. Right, Alicia.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. So thank you so much for that introduction, Rocki, and thank you to the panelists for such interesting papers. Building on things from both of their papers, my focus today is on 2 modern representations of the labyrinth and some underemphasized themes of the original myth that I believe these modern representations bring to the forefront: technology and female empowerment. The 2 labyrinth receptions I'll be looking at are television shows: Doctor Who's 2011 episode, The God Complex, and Legacy's 2019 episode, Screw Endgame. In The God Complex, Amy, Rory, and the Doctor are pulled out of the time vortex to land in what seems to be a cheap 80s motel, only it has labyrinthine, endless hallways, innumerable rooms seemingly full of people's worst fears, and a minotaur that kills you once you find your own personal room. In the end, it turns out each person's room represents what they have faith in, and the minotaur consumes that faith, killing the person. The Doctor has to force Amy to lose her faith in him, severing the minotaur's food supply, killing the monster, and revealing the labyrinthine hotel to be an automated prison for the minotaur-like alien. In Screw Endgame, Lizzie and Hope meet the Keeper, a young woman from the 80s who sucks them into the game, which is a labyrinth that looks exactly like their hometown, but has the mechanics of an 8-bit video game. The only way out of the game is for one of the girls to offer to take the Keeper's place, or be killed by the minotaur that is chasing them. While both the girls think the only way to escape their destiny is to take the deal, in the end they end up killing the minotaur, releasing themselves and the Keeper from the internal torment. For the sake of time, I'm going to assume we all have a working knowledge of the basics of the labyrinth myth. Both of these shows are clearly receptions of the labyrinth. However, they both emphasize the labyrinth's relationship with technology more prominently than most other interpretations. Although based in myth, even at the time they were writing, both Herodotus and Pliny speak of the Cretan labyrinth as if it were real, and a shining example not only of Daedalus' skill, but also technology. Thus, it is a prime example of techne, skill, and the result of that skill. Despite this, a lot of models of the labyrinth are magical, like in Percy Jackson and Sudaranese. In contrast, the labyrinth of Doctor's automated prison, so well crafted, prompts the Doctor to the craftsmanship involved. Can you imagine? Meanwhile, the labyrinth of legacies is while the labyrinth of legacies is magical, its video game mechanics represent the most innovative technology its keeper is aware of. Thus, both Doctor Who and Legacies in their technological labyrinths bring technology to the fore. Another aspect of the original myth that these receptions bring out is the idea of female empowerment. Ovid and Catullus, who wrote the longer accounts of Theseus, Ariadne, and the labyrinth, write through the perspective of Ariadne, and in doing so emphasize the agency she demonstrated in choosing to give Theseus the thread that allows him to defeat the Minotaur. The female protagonists of both Doctor Who and Legacies also make choices in the labyrinth that allow them to empower themselves. Amy, in choosing to lose her faith in the Doctor, kills the Minotaur and begins to live life on her own terms. She is no longer the girl who waited. And in Legacies, Lizzie and Hope, both of whom have what seem to be inescapable destinies, find another way out of the labyrinth by killing the Minotaur, and thus decide to find another way in real life rather than live in fear of their destinies. Thus, just like Ariadne, Amy, Lizzie, and Hope all screw endgame, to quote Hope, and empower themselves characters in their own stories through the death of the Minotaur and their escape from the labyrinth. I know that was a lot to cover in 5 minutes, and I encourage you to watch my full recorded talk. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have here, or feel free to contact me via email or Twitter, both of which you can see on your screens now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. I encourage everyone here to watch all of the talks. They're really excellent. All right, so a reminder to put questions to me in directly to me in the chat. And as you kind of think about that, I'll start. I just wanted to make a few comments and things I noticed about your talks. You know how we have this wonderful labyrinth theme, which is so fitting, of course, and really this idea of these prisons and traps, not of our protagonists' own making. And then as I was watching all your talks, another L word came to mind. I was thinking about like limen and how all your talks deal with like limna and various boundaries between, you know, monstrosity and sanity, death and life, ill health and well-being. And, you know, you all made me think about how these boundaries might be traversed or even erased. And so, Angelique, when you talk about, and you all give so much hope, every talk was so hopeful, right? So, Angelique, you talk about what Persephone gains from her death experience and how she, you know, how the patient can come back out of that with a sort of more purpose and meaning as they live. And then Alicia and Hamish, of course, you both similarly show how your protagonists regain a kind of agency and escape their labyrinths. So I just very much appreciated all the optimistic messages of these talks. So to begin, I'll just go in order. Again, as I wait for questions, and I hope our audience members will put questions to me. Hamish, thank you for introducing me to these new minotaurs and new portrayals of them. Since they are not, you know, not monsters, and I feel like with this postmodern presentation, there's this reframing of what's monstrous. I was wondering what does postmodern monstrosity look like in these novels? You get at it a little bit in your talks. I just was hoping you could talk about it a little bit more here.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Rocki. Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah, that all right? Great. Yeah, so I mean, the whole labyrinth thing was just to touch on some of your introductory remarks was very interesting for me because I wasn't going to talk too much about the labyrinth, and then seeing that the panel was on labyrinth, I kind of sort of worked through the combination of the Minotaur and labyrinth sort of topoi. So that was interesting to kind of use to kind of work through that as I wrote this paper. And the liminars, certainly there's definitely a border crossing there from the labyrinth and getting out of the labyrinth, right? So that's definitely relevant to it and was connected to all our papers. I very much like the idea of hope and optimism in these stories, and I think that's a key kind of element, especially of I think this is probably I highly recommend a novel to read. The Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break, and you know this Minotaur, he's from Crete. He is actual Minotaur in this case. It's not a metaphor, but he's got the horns. He's got the memories of ancient Crete, of living in the labyrinth and killing innocents there, right? But he's got this sort of PTSD, and he's suffering in modern day America, and he's got all these complexes, and everything's always going wrong with these little sort of incidents in his life, but still he's kind of retaining this hope in spite of his constant failures. And it's a hope which is kind of directed towards the present, because this Minotaur is kind of stuck. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the sort of hope theme, and I'll get to the monstrosity in a moment. But this idea of hope was so important for me in this novel, and the idea of the labyrinth was quite complex in the story. It's not a spatial labyrinth as in other stories, right? This Minotaur in modern America can go where he wants. Right, he lives actually in like a trailer park, but the idea is that labyrinths are such a temporal. There's constant references in the story to his past and future being the same, and because he can't die, he's immortal. There's this eternity ahead of him, which is a future, and there's also the past is kind of all the same. So he's kind of navigating through these labyrinths of days, and he finds hope in small moments with people and things, objects in his presence. And so there's constant references to the hope of the present moment, these small things, trying to connect with people, and he constantly fails at that, but this is the point of his hope, that he retains this constant hope in spite of these failures. So that's so important in this story. Actually, interestingly, it is a side point in the follow-up story, which is called The Minotaur Takes His Own Sweet Time, which was written in 2016. This is from 2000. The author actually uses the Greek metaphors of past as being in front and future as being behind to describe the Minotaur. So I thought that was cool how he picks up on that Greek metaphor. But okay, about monstrosity, your actual question. Absolutely. So I think in receptions of the Minotaur, like in sword and sandal films, like the Wild Beast of Crete, right? It's just an othered monster. It's physically hideous and it must be slain, right? And we see this also in other genres. Like Mary Renault's The King Must Die. It's historical fiction. We have this Prince Asterion, but Renault actually kind of adopts an orientalizing language and makes him kind of other, and so it's kind of okay that he's killed. So there's still a physical otherness, and it's okay to kill him because of that. Even in, I think, psychological narratives, which we've looked at, there's this idea that it's the Minotaur. You should kill this demon in your head. But so I use the word postmodern very loosely as a kind of just a rewriting of this motif, and a reframing of monstrosity in terms of looking at more in terms of disorders. Right, all these characters have actual medical type disorders, and all the writers kind of frame this in very realistic modern terms. Cheryl focuses on the actual physical side of these disorders. Bob Revine's narrator in the detective story really focuses on this autistic experience, right? So there's a scientific kind of rationalization of this otherness, which turns these traditional hideousness, it frames it as a sort of disorder. And this creates empathy for the reader of these stories. But as I say, it's more than just empathy, which is sort of diminishing a bit, but it's about taking these Minotaurs on their own journeys. And I think people who experience similar problems about helping them overcome these disorders. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but yeah.
Just to follow, do you think that, I feel like that you suggested this maybe in your talk, that some of these new monsters might be, for instance, in the first book, Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break, the people who are kind of making fun of him, the bullies, so are perhaps the monsters, the people who are trying to get you to be normal, the people who are expecting this when you're putting this on you, or not understanding. Is that a new kind of monster that's coming out?
Definitely, I'll say in all these stories, kind of society is really the monster. The people around the Minotaur and Minotaur Takes a Cigarette Break who are mocking him, abusing him because of his social anxiety. It's not so much because of his horns, which they kind of ignore, but it's really because he's kind of socially awkward person and he can't kind of communicate and function normally in society. So he's really ostracized. And definitely it's the so-called normal people who are behaving monstrously. It's the same in the detective story. It's really John Cosway, who's this autistic man, is regarded by his very abusive family because they want to inherit the property, but he has the property rights. So they're actually trying to have him invalidated as being mentally insane. Okay, but it turns out he's actually a very rational, sane person, and the family is really quite mad, although they apparently are medically, normal. But so there's this idea throughout these stories of society being somehow monstrous and the Minotaur being normal, even though he has these disorders. Certainly, yeah. Thank
you very much. So Hamish, your monstrosity question reminds me of Alicia's talk, because I feel like the Doctor is sort of cast as a bit of a Theseus, right? He said, I took you. I just can't get that out of my, I took you with me because I was vain and because I needed to be adored. And I'm wondering, with the Minotaurs, with the trapped one, right, being kind of a new hero, is the traditional hero now kind of the monster? And I did want to, I had a point of clarification too. I was wondering, not to clarify on you because I haven't seen it, but just to ask about, what the connection is between the Minotaur, who's an alien, right? Who's a kind of alien, and they go around and they try to set up their own worship.
Yeah.
And what the connection is between that, I was a little confused. And Theseus, Amy having faith in Theseus and needing to lose that faith for the Minotaur to die, which Angelique, by the way, reminds me of your talk too, which we'll get to. And we have questions coming in, so I don't want to go too long on that. But yeah, do you, any thoughts on that?
So
connection?
at the end of the Doctor Who episode, it's revealed that this Minotaur-looking alien is an alien that feeds on faith. And so that's why the people, and like it travels around, sets itself up in a place and makes people start worshiping it so it can stay alive. And then, as the Doctor says, as people grow more advanced, they learn technology and they get more secular, they realize maybe we should not worship this being, and they try to imprison it somehow. So that's why this, prison in space that floats around came into being. And so, that's why there's the faith connection there. I do know, if you just think about, Ariadne had to have a lot of faith in Theseus in order to follow him anyway. So I don't know if that's the best clarification or answer to your question, but that's what I got right now.
Okay. All right. We'll come back to some of that. I do want to get to some of these questions, and there are a lot coming in. Thank you so much, everyone. All right. So a question for Angelique. This question is from Kirsten. Hi, Kirsten. And she asks, I wonder if Angelique has explored other uses of the myth of Demeter and Persephone. For instance, I had a friend who lost a daughter in a car accident and processed her grief through this myth and exploring it in art. I can imagine other illnesses and deaths that would benefit from the use of this myth as well. Yeah, and I hope this is headed towards publication so I can use it in my classes.
Yes. Thank you for this question. Yes, I actually have, because bereavement is one path, is one really is a way to work with the myth, and I have worked through the years with loss, especially of a child, and it feels quite pertinent, and also even perhaps stronger emotionally. It ends up being experienced and also being integrated into the client's dreams. So as we start working with the archetypal symbols, the person responds bringing back dreams, which we feed again into our work. So it can really be very enriching from the point of view of a therapist, to be able to use. There's so many rich aspects, there's so many elements one can have as tools in the work. But not only with grief, but I also work with people with neurological disorders, for example, strokes, and which means a severe loss. They have to deal afterwards with severe losses, physical losses. And again, that's where also some of the archetypal structures and symbols I also work with people in neurorehabilitation, as we call it. So psychotherapy for neurological rehabilitation is also another domain where I have worked, I have experimented working with the archetypal symbols of the myth. And I feel that again is very rewarding for the people. They use the imagery. They respond. Some people have responded through art to me back by writing a poem because of the story, because it is related to their personal experience, because the phases are working. They feel are working through them. So there, I think it's a very powerful narrative that activates the unconscious responses of the psyche while being in a healing process of any kind of loss. So I consider it very powerful in its And also it allows us in all these cases to be able to respect the seasons, if you like, not rushing or quite rationally, or not delaying into the different stages, but really observing the more natural cycles. So it is helping both of us, I think, in the work to keep with what's happening organically, rather than impose rational schedules on it. We are following the work of the mysteries rather than having our own timetables. It's a more humble process that I feel proves more efficient in the end for the client.
You say something at the end of your talk that really strikes me about the sort of the ultimate mystery. Like we don't know whether there'll be renewed life or there'll be death. And because I was thinking, when I was first hearing your talk, I was thinking there was a sort of implied hope of recovery. And so, and this is, sorry, the bummer question, but I was wondering if the approach is different if the prognosis is not so good. And then do you mentioned Orpheus and Eurydice at the end of your talk. And that's more about resignation and, to our mortality and all these things. So I was wondering, do you use other myths? And I have a similar question too from Meredith, if you use other myths, Minotaur and Labyrinth in general, or other myths to deal with a little bit different outcome?
Yes, I do. I haven't, and thank you for the question. I haven't used the Minotaur as much, although Ariadne's trust to Theseus and him betraying it, and Dionysus' role in this, and the sacred marriage with Dionysus, I am using quite a bit into working with women, quite a bit. But I think, yes, other myths, yes, and other archetypal symbols also, Dionysian also, and the idea of dismembering, which is a very, again, powerful tool for us as therapists, and the idea of recollection of this dismembering, the way it is presented in Bacchae. So part of my work is doing seminars, and currently I'm teaching on the Bacchae, of the psychological elements of this dissolution and dismemberment, in order for enantiodromia, to bring back the reunion of these parts. This is a very, again, I'm using this a lot in my work, dissolution and recomposition. Now, entering the difficult, the bummer question, as you said, it's not very different, but there are some elements that differ if we know me and the person that they have a terminal diagnosis. And I think then I have found that through the dreams, the archetypal symbols are even stronger, and more myths can be related to them. It's as if before death, the psyche, the unconscious precipitates images, even more archetypal than usual, making it a bit more prominent for me, to retrieve figures from mythology, from ancient Greek mythology mainly, but also Indian or others. So Buddhist, Tantric Buddhism, for example, has elements I am using. So there are many different mythologies from Antiquity that I am drawing on. Of course, the time is limited, but some people seem to want something like that. I think it helps. Myth and symbol helps releasing the emotional vibrancy, and it is what exactly feeds the person back with a strength that we can't find in today's stories. Sometimes it's hard. We still do, but it's not as powerful or as quick. It doesn't trigger as quick the client's psyche if you go by something modern. Well, if they like, they bring it. And then it's interesting what they feedback, bringing a painting of theirs, of part of the story of the mysteries, or a poem written on the Dionysian dismemberment, or aspects like that. So again, this is very interesting and useful for me to feed back in my work. So I received from them. Now, heading towards death, it's also, we include, if we know it's a palliative case, then we also include, if you like, work regarding goodbyes, in this case of Orpheus and Eurydice. So not retrieving quite what they had in mind, but enlarging the space of the time left, and also a sense of eternity, I think. So myths that go more with eternal life, and so a little bit slightly different aspects of the Eleusinian aspects, I would say.
Thank you so much. I feel like, yeah, it's so wonderful that it actually is so useful for you in this therapeutic setting. And I think all of us appreciate it as, reception people. So, because we're running out of time, a wonderful question from Zoe for Alicia. I love the emphasis in your talk on the female empowerment narrative and the original myths and their adaptation in modern media. There's been a spike in romance novels that feature a minotaur as the main romantic lead. And I'm just curious how you see that fitting in with the idea of female empowerment.
Yeah, so one thing, so like in especially the Legacies episode, there's a huge emphasis on like this labyrinth / the Minotaur being a symbol of the patriarchy. One of the characters learns that this whole labyrinth was created because there was a wizard who was spurned by a woman, and he decided to entrap her in there. And then it becomes a cycle of women entrapping women. And as she kills the Minotaur, she says, it's like taking the keeper's deal would be perpetuating the patriarchy. In the same way, we can see Amy Pond's, she's been following the Doctor her entire life. She hasn't been the main character in her own narrative. So she's been, patriarchally, following this leader figure. And so each of them, in a way, their killing of the Minotaur allows them to, not really escape the patriarchy, but like shove it in the face of the patriarchy. And I can see, romance novels being similar to that. It's a means of female empowerment in a world that, with patriarchal norms wants women to be, sexually subservient to them. It allows them to empower them. It's an empowering way to, express sexuality in a society that would rather have, a more normal, male-centered female sexuality.
Just to piggyback on that, I was thinking about how you talk about technology, and wondering if the technology sort of compensates for so much of us just as in our human weakness as a species, and we're made strong with this technology. I'm wondering, do you see technology, and this is a big question, so you might just want to take this and think about it later, but I was wondering if it functions at all, if you see ways that it functions to erase the kind of patriarchal ties that that are keeping women in this unequal position. So if it actually helps kind of bolster their
Yeah, so I tried to look into this. Now I am currently it's very hard for me. I'm not close to any university library, so my resources were limited. But I really wanted to look into especially Greek techne, whether or not there was conceptions of female techne versus male techne, and what female, because the thread that Ariadne gives would probably be considered a female techne because it's used for weaving, sewing, a female technology creation. So, in a way, she uses that, like she uses the technology she knows to help Theseus and escape.
Right.
And so I see, you know, and then the parallel stories of, you know, Amy and then Lizzie and Hope, you know, they're forced into these technology. They're not the ones using the technology at the beginning, but in the end, they use the technology, or it's thanks to the technology of the labyrinth that they are able to then, you know, break away from the patriarchy in a similar way to what Ariadne did.
Nice. Thank you. Okay, so I feel like there's more we could go on there, but Hamish, I'm going to go back to you. This question is from Janice. The Minotaur in the myth is a man-eater, the quintessential mythic threat to culture and civilization that must be dispatched by a mythic hero to save not only individual human beings, but also culture writ large. Does this threatening side of the Minotaur survive in the remakes, or is he just a misunderstood soul?
Well, in these three works I looked at, I mean, that's a very interesting question. In the three works I looked at, obviously, he's only only in the story, the Minotaur to accessible. Is it actually the real Minotaur, right? In the other stories I'm looking at, it's used metaphorically to refer to certain people with disorders, right? So I in that sense, two of these stories, I mean, that question doesn't really apply to, I think, to two of those stories. In terms of this story, so what is the crux of the question again? Do they rewrite?
So, and I think it could maybe apply too to the metaphorical minotaurs. Just if this monster is a threat to culture, just as the original one is to culture and civilization, do you see any of that, vestiges of that in these new?
Not at all. No, it's exactly the opposite. It's a very marginalized, oppressed individual who's very much trapped in his own labyrinth. It's obviously often a man, right, as we've seen, but not at all. He's in all the stories I look at. He is exactly not a danger to society. I would say not at all. No, I can't think of ways in which they are. I mean, obviously, the Minotaur takes a cigarette break. He has been a danger, but his past is really a trauma to him, and he, I think, in some occasions in the books, imagines hurting people again, but he just can't bring himself to do it. He's got such post-traumatic stress that he can't even imagine that. So yeah, they are completely not like that anymore, I would say. No.
Okay.
Yeah, I had so many comments about other papers. I was like writing down notes. I mean, I find the feminine narrative very interesting, which Alicia was talking about, and of course this relates to Cretomania in general. Minoan Crete is a feminine milieu, and there's so many stories, like from Robert Graves' 7 Days in New Crete, which picture Crete as, well, it's actually in France in the story, but it's called New Crete, as a kind of ideal feminine community. And there's so many of these stories which look at the yin and the yang of Minoan religion. There's a story by Moira Caldecott called The Lily and the Bull, which looks at the passive side of the female peaceful side of Minoan religion versus this aggressive masculine side, which is associated with Poseidon and the bull. So there's so many of these stories, especially in the 60s and 70s, with second wave feminism, which appropriate Minoan Crete along these terms. And other stories, Paul Anderson's The Dancer from Atlantis. So there's so many of these novels in the 60s and 70s, which you can touch on. That idea of the Minotaur being an uber masculine figure. In fact, and another great story for that is Stephen King's Rose Madder. Stephen King's Rose Madder is about this abusive husband like Jack from The Shining, who actually turns into a bull. He's got this primitive archetypal masculine rage, a bit like you get in Dante, and he actually slowly turns into a bull. He puts on a mask of Ferdinand the Bull, rather humoristically, but actually at the end of the story, he enters this magical quasi-Minoan world and becomes a bull, and the female character actually helps slaughter him at the end of the story. So this is a very powerful feminist narrative. So I've written about this already, but I'd recommend looking at Stephen King's Rose Madder for this idea of killing the bull as a strong feminine action. I also wanted to respond to Angelique and say that Freud, I have a passage I can copy. Apparently Freud was very interested in the Minoan labyrinths, and I'll copy a quote in the comments about that, but he reacted to it, into this archetypal, I don't know if you can see the I just dropped a sort of quote from Freud there. But apparently he saw it as like an omphalos, like this of female attachment to the mother, sort of contrasting with the Oedipal complex. I'm not sure if that's kind of looking at Crete as a maternal sphere. I'm not sure what Freud said about the labyrinths as a sort of twisting, turning site of the mind. I would also be interested to hear if Jung had some ideas about the Cretan labyrinths, if he received that. I'm sorry, I kind of have more questions than answers. I didn't really answer the question, which was posed to me very well, but I enjoyed the panelists' conversations so much. Yeah.
Angelique or Alicia, do you have comment responses to Hamish's?
I can if Alicia doesn't have. I cannot speak about Freud as he's not part of my work or training, but I can speak for Jung, and he certainly had quite. He is referring quite a bit on the idea of the labyrinth as a path. An encrypted path, an encoded path as a way to access the self with a capital S. So, so the labyrinth is like the sacred space, like a kind of a temenos, and the way to take that path towards the center is the way of, if you like, the way towards the process of individuation. So for him, it's a power symbol. And as far as I know from his letters we see that he was using it quite a bit in his dream analysis with his clients. The idea of the labyrinth and the secrets of how to go in and how to return. Also in some of his seminars, the vision seminars, as far as I know, and I'm not sure if he also refers to it in the Kundalini seminars, but in the vision seminars, I think possibly he does. He analyzes the dreams of a female client. And that's where he refers quite a bit into Ariadne's archetype and how to access the labyrinth and how the unconscious gives you sign over the secrets of accessing and being able to safely return. So it's for him becomes a symbol of meeting with the unconscious, but being able to keep a strong ego consciousness at the same time. So staying intact while taking the journey becomes important. This Jung's dialogue between ego consciousness and the unconscious. Thank you for.
Alicia, did you have anything to?
Yeah, so I was just gonna, talking about, your other the Minotaur as a symbol of the patriarchy sort of thing. But I also think it's interesting. So, more modern feminist theory has been arguing that toxic masculinity is actually a symptom of patriarchy. So if we see the Minotaur as a symbol of toxic patriarchy, as a symbol of toxic masculinity, he is also in theory a, victim of patriarchy, similar in the way the original Minotaur was the product of an illicit sexual affair between a woman and a bull. And Minos was like, I have to hide this. My wife did something. This is just bad. And so he is a victim, without even the weird masculine part, just he is forced to be hidden away because his mother did something that was not, according to the patriarchy, what should be done. And so I think building on turning the Minotaur into this, hyper masculine, toxic masculine symbol that must be, destroyed to get rid of the patriarchy is both following the myth, but also taking that sort of victimhood away from the Minotaur in an interesting way.
Yeah, for sure. I think we have time for one more question. So I have a question for you, and the Meredith has something similar, so I'm going to mush them together. When when you talked about how the labyrinths of Rick Riordan of the Percy Jackson series and what was the other thing?
Piranesi?
Were magical. And then you were talking about how the ones in the two pieces you looked at today were technological. Even though there's some magical element, I think, in one of them, and at least one of them. And so, of course, it reminded me of the oft quoted Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so I feel like magic and technology come up together a lot. And then, of course, to Meredith's point, magic and technology and the divine, and how, sometimes technology is doing what the divine does in the narrative. And so I was wondering if you had any comments about that connection. The fact that you have magical ones and technological ones. Is there a reason why they're almost sort of interchangeable? Or do you see it happen in other places?
Yeah, so I mean, in my talk, and I mentioned briefly, like Rick Riordan's Labyrinth, it actually starts as like a physical, like built in Minoan Creek sort of thing, that then it's implied that, because like in the Rick Riordan universe, like you can have children of Athena that aren't like actually like Athena does not birth these children. She like just gives them from her mind, kind of like the way she was born. And it's implied that Daedalus is a child of Athena, and he uses the magical powers he gets from being her child in order to build this. And he imbues it with a evil consciousness that then it grows on its own and starts to just like live underneath our entire world. And so it does start as like a singular piece of technology that, yes, he uses his magical abilities to like build, but then because he uses this magic, it then grows on its own. So that's a really interesting like conflation of, well, the way it's depicted in the books in modern day, it's very magical. It did start as like a physical piece of technology. So it's also like the ways in which like that's just interesting, like the way in which like technology from the ancient world, which would not seem to be, possibly magical to us today because, they did not have the technological advances, can actually be more magical than what we would expect.
That's fascinating too, because there's this idea of, that technology being a reflection of us. And so if he has this sort of evil intention, that it kind of takes on, also takes on his character and reflects him. All right, that is, we do need to wrap it up. There are some comments for individual presenters that we will make sure you get, and any questions that went unanswered, but we'll make sure you see all of those comments. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of it. But thank you everyone for attending. Please attend the next session, which I think is in 15 minutes, right? Is that our national identities? Our next panel, national identity and antiquity at 10:45 Eastern time. And thank you, everyone.
Yep, we'll be in Forum B. Just toggle over there from the program, and we'll see you there.
Thank you, presenters.
Yep, round of applause.
Yes, you all are amazing. All right. So yes, I'm going to save the chat, and our officers will get all of these comments to you. Paula's has all this French in it. I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna butcher this French. It's been a long time. So, okay. Tech people, can you remind me where to save the chat?
If you look down on the bottom of your chat, you see little icons. Like there's a smiley face on the lower right. You should see a little like a piece of paper with a bent corner.
Save chat.
Yeah, that should do it.
Okay.
And then it should open a window, a dialog box, like in your Zoom folder, or it creates a file in a Zoom folder on your desktop.
Oh, okay. And then we'll find it. Okay.
Yeah.
I've done it before. I just haven't really used Zoom much in the last year, which is nice. Nice to be in person. Is there any other final business before we go?
Roger, anything else to close out the session?
No, I'm sorry that I missed 90% of the session because of a commitment out, but sounds great.
It was
Sure.
such a productive conversation, I think. Thank you guys so much for your work, and it's all super fascinating.
Thank you very much for giving us the
Hamish, I'm
opportunity.
going to write you a note. I'll be in touch with you later on.
Okay, that sounds good, Hamish, and
Okay.
you take care. All right, I'll see you all at the next one.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.